Shana Tova, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to my home. This summer, our congregation engaged in a communal reading and discussion of Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I co-facilitated with my friend and teacher, Reverend Kim McNair. This was one of several responses made by our community to the acts of violence against African Americans that shocked our country over the past months. No, this violence is not new, but the horrific images made possible by the ubiquity of cell phones meant that this scourge could no longer be ignored. In reading Kendi's book, one theme struck especially close to home. He argues that to be an anti-racist, one is obliged to speak out against the basic notion of racial stereotypes, and therefore must equally denounce all forms of bigotry or prejudice. It's not enough to denounce bias against our people. We are obligated to denounce the very idea that individuals may be characterized through their affiliations to ethnic or religious groups. This message reminded me of the otherwise eminently forgettable 2002 Austin Powers sequel, Goldmember. I know, it sounds like a stretch, but stick with me here. Kendi's message recalls a ridiculous line offered by the actor Michael Caine, as his character addresses the villain, who happens to be from Holland. "There are only two things I can't stand in this world," he says: people who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch. The statement's humor is derived not only from its blatant hypocrisy, but also its resonance in our culture. All too often, we hear that hatred is bad, except when it's directed against the people I don't like. Historically, liberation movements have at times invoked their own sense of hatred. Over the summer, the Black Lives Matter movement was marred by viciously anti-Semitic statements made by notable entertainers and athletes such as Deshaun Jackson, Nick Cannon, Ice Cube, Allen Iverson, and Steven Jackson. This recalled the original Black Lives Matter platform, which included the insidious accusation of Israel being a genocidal state, and also the Women's March, several of whose leaders were eventually removed due to their own anti-Semitism, and the LGBT March 2 years ago in Chicago, in which Jews carrying rainbow flags with the Star of David were prohibited from participating, or the demonstrators in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who strayed from the march long enough to vandalize the local synagogue, or even the Chappaqua Interfaith demonstration against banning visitors from Muslim countries, in which a speaker utilized the platform to invoke violent canards about the Jewish state. In these cases, and so many more, the message seems to be that group hatred is bad unless it's directed at a group that I hate. But as Austin Powers taught us, you can't hate both racists and the Dutch. 2 years ago, our civil rights trip concluded with a visit to Atlanta's Ebenezer Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. once preached, and where civil rights icon John Lewis was recently memorialized. However, on the day our group visited, the guest pastor delivered a sermon to the hundreds present, quoting from the Gospel of John, castigating the Jews for forgetting their history. We Bethel members sat respectfully as the pastor lectured that the Jews don't know their history and the Jews have forgotten where they came from. For the 30 of us who had given up our time and our resources to learn more about the civil rights movement, it was a slap in the face. Moments such as these make advocacy and alliance building all the more challenging. But it does not give us permission to leave the arena altogether. If anything, moments such as this calls for greater engagement and dialogue, as was demonstrated recently by Jewish football players such as Julian Edelman and Mitchell Schwartz in response to Deshaun Jackson's comments, in which they reached out and offered an opportunity for education. Nevertheless, as a politically active citizen and Jew, I'm deeply bothered by the knowledge that well-intended demonstrations can easily devolve towards anti-Zionism and with it anti-Semitism. I enter the political space with my guard up, worrying about when and from where the next attack will come. This fear deeply saddens me, and I must confess, erodes my willingness to demonstrate in support of other historically disenfranchised peoples. Denying my own proud sense of Jewish identity and strong support for Jewish self-determination ought not serve as a prerequisite to fighting for progressive causes. But all too often, this is exactly the case. To support other persecuted peoples, we are sometimes asked to first renounce the support of our own. As American Jews, we are especially familiar with what Kendi titles behavioral racism, making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of ethnic groups, and making ethnic groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. Behavioral racism teaches that all members of the group are equally complicit and so equally responsible for the perceived wrongs of any member of that group. So anyone upset with Israeli policy ought to target the local synagogue with graffiti because the behavior of this group of American Jews is somehow tied to the actions of another group of Jews across the world. Or that the behavior of reprehensible individuals, such as Jeffrey Epstein or Bernie Madoff, may inform our view of Jews overall as a group. Frankly, this is something we all do. We hear about a public figure engaging in a heinous act, and the first thing we think is, I hope they're not Jewish. Otherwise, we say it'll be a shanda for the goyim, an embarrassment in front of the non-Jews. As American Jews, we ought to recognize that this fear stems from an acceptance of the belief that any individual's actions bear responsibility upon the entire group. To worry that Jews will be perceived as evil or controlling only gives credence by buying into this view and into the stereotype. I dream of the day in which a Jeffrey Epstein is arrested and his Jewishness does not worry me, because he's just a person, and what happens to him has no bearing on me. I know I'm not there yet, but I'd love to believe that day will come. Before we point the finger of behavioral racism towards others, we ought to examine our own Jewish community's biases as well. After all, Kendi demonstrates so compellingly that minority groups have often been driven through competition for white acceptance to denigrate and malign one another. This is especially prevalent between contemporaneous immigrant groups who struggle to define themselves against one another. While many Jewish immigrants arrived in America with understood mistrust, if not hatred, of groups who had persecuted them, like the Cossacks in Europe, they soon developed their own animosity towards their new American neighbors, the Irish, the Italians, the Polish, the Puerto Ricans, the African Americans, to name a few. Many of our parents, our grandparents, and great-grandparents partook in racial stereotyping of things like the alcoholic Irish, the gullible Polish, and even the Schwarze, the animalistic African American. At times, our ancestors rallied against hatred of Jews while participating in their own brand of racial demonization. In effect, they professed hatred of both racists and the Dutch. I don't mean to judge our recent ancestors, many of whom made incredible sacrifices to provide for the opportunities that we enjoy today. We ought to understand the pressures, the experiences, the motivations which underscored their worldview. Rather, I echo Kendi's observation that those who enjoy established power benefit from the competition and animosity conjured between less established groups. Our grandparents and great-grandparents readily pursued acceptance through assimilation towards the standard of white Christian America. They shaved their beards, muted their Yiddish or Ladino, and built church-like synagogues with stained glass windows and organs. As one of our younger congregants recently taught me, Jewish actors readily dabbled in blackface to demonstrate their otherness from African Americans. Over time, a people once regarded as Oriental in background were knighted with whiteness. Perhaps it is for this reason that we Jews are unique in both benefiting from white privilege and being targeted by white supremacy. Such a vantage point affords us a unique space. We have the platform to call out for justice and equality, and yet the personal experience to understand personally the toll of hatred and bigotry. Maybe this is why Jewish participation in issues of inequality stands far beyond our population figures. This history helps us also to understand where the anti-Semitism demonstrated by African Americans such as Nick Cannon and Deshaun Jackson stems. As Jews and blacks often lived side by side and competed for resources and acceptance, tension was bound to appear. For many African Americans, their experiences with Jews came in the form of shop owners and landlords. Jews and African Americans occupied similar spaces like Harlem, the Bronx, and Queens, in which they struggled to assimilate into white America. When friction arose with surrounding communities, it was inevitably often with Jews. Ultimately, the Jewish community participated in the white flight to the suburbs as towns such as Chappaqua began rescinding districting guidelines prohibiting the sale of property to Jews. Such a historical understanding of racial animosity does not mean we should turn a deaf ear towards the Louis Farrakhans of the world. But it does underscore the urgent need for all minority groups to fight against any and all forms of bigotry, especially within their own ranks. We need to publicly credit and laud members of those communities who speak out against such hatred, such as Jamil Hill, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Michael Wilbon, who did so with passion and courage over the past months. And we mustn't ignore the proud history of Jews and African Americans marching side by side in the civil rights movement, or the way in which the Black Power movement inspired a renewed sense of Jewish identity and activism. There is much history we ought to be proud of. We also need to understand the pattern at play here. We Jews benefit from our enduring legacy of 4,000 years of history. But our longevity also means that we were around when other religious groups were struggling to establish themselves. And every new religion needs to do two things: explain why it is necessary and why the status quo is insufficient. It is no wonder then that the New Testament, and especially the Gospel of John, goes to such lengths to cast Jews as sinful and misbegotten. 700 years later, the prophet Muhammad came to the Jews of Medina who refused to adhere to his message. And so at times, the Quran similarly portrays Jews as mistaken non-believers. Now, these stereotypes are difficult to erase, but before we get on our high horse, we must acknowledge that the Torah does the exact same thing. It calls the Moabites the children of incest. It commands that we kill every member of the tribe of Amalek, including their children, and burn their settlements to the ground. The only difference is that there no longer exist Moabites, Amalekites, or Edomites to raise their hands and point out when the Torah is out of line. But the pattern is evident. Competing groups consistently demonize one another in an attempt to secure legitimacy, and each time it only benefits the entrenched hegemony. The complete embrace of anti-racism calls on we members of the Jewish community to not only consider our external biases, but our internal ones as well. This includes elements within our own Jewish community, in which the established norm of the white-looking Ashkenazi Jew is referenced to reject Jews of color, such as Sephardic, Mizrahi, and African Jews. This Ashkenormative perspective includes the idea of the shiksa, the blonde and fair-skinned Jew who is often assumed to have converted. Such stereotypes often linger, despite the rich diversity with which our community is blessed. The time has come to discard them as well, along with the saying, "But you don't look Jewish." Take it from me, a Jew who grew up in Hawaii among a Jewish community that was significantly mixed Asian. There is no such thing as looking Jewish. If there's one thing I take from Kendi's book, it is that to serve as an effective anti-racist, one must stand in equal opposition to all forms of bigotry and hatred. This means that as a Jewish American, I am obligated to stand with my African American brothers and sisters in renouncing racist attitudes and policies. I cannot stand against anti-Semitism alone. I must defend my fellow citizens against any and all forms of group stereotype and hatred. Similarly, as a Jewish American, I am obligated to stand with members of the LGBT community. I cannot claim to be anti-racist while espousing homophobic or transphobic views. And I am obligated to stand with my Muslim American brothers and sisters against hatred against their communities, especially when it comes from certain Jewish communities. I cannot claim to be anti-racist and at the same time Islamophobic. I can't hate both racists and the Dutch. It also means that I can't stand against anti-Semitism while at the same time treating non-Ashkenazi Jews as different or any lesser. Just as Kendi calls out the African American community for its unequal treatment of those with darker complexions, we Jews ought to consider the same. Diversity and inclusion are not simply virtues that ought to be pursued. They are fundamental qualities towards the eradication of anti-Semitism alongside all other forms of group hatred. Like most things, we are inextricably in this fight together. And so in response to the past month's events, we are dedicating our new year of study towards engaging in difficult conversations around race, hatred, and inequality. We will begin on Yom Kippur by continuing our conversation with Reverend McNair, who will lead an interactive exercise around implicit bias. Later that day, I will sit down with Horace Greeley Principal Andrew Corsilia and Chapel School Superintendent Christine Ackerman, along with Rabbi Aaron Brusso of Bet Torah, for a discussion around how to raise our students as moral citizens and around the code of conduct and school curriculum, both of which were updated partially in response to racist incidents which came to light within our own school system. We will then continue with a series of conversations and study opportunities throughout the fall, including how to speak with our children about matters of race, how to engage in meaningful dialogue over complex and volatile issues, and what wisdom our Jewish tradition and text have to offer on these matters. We will discuss the experiences of Jews of color and the ways in which they have been sometimes overlooked by the Jewish community. I am delighted to welcome several guest speakers to our series with the hope of providing a diversity of opinions and expertise on these difficult matters. Please see the adult education brochure which was included in your High Holiday resource bag. You can also find all the information, as always, on our website. And so today, as we turn the page on a deeply challenging year 5780 and voice our hopes and our promises for a healthy and happy 5781, may we dedicate ourselves towards creating a more just and equitable society for all of us. May we strive to fulfill the prophetic vision as guided by our sage Hillel, who asked, "In ein ani li mili," if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Ukshe'ani la'atzmi ma'ani, but if I'm only for myself, then who am I? V'imlo achshav imotai, and if not now, then when? Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova.